So, good morning. I'm here to talk about emerald ash borer, specifically in Colorado, Boulder even more specifically. I'm going to quickly go through how we detected it, what it looks like in Colorado, what our strategy was to manage it, and our lessons learned. I tend to talk really fast, and I have lots of pictures on my slides, but the organizers have the presentation and can post it or whatever. So, and like Ralph said, we'll be here all day. We'll be on the panel. If you guys have any questions, we are happy to answer questions. So how did EAB get to Colorado? When we detected it in 2013, the nearest infestation was 600 miles away in Kansas City. So as Deb had said earlier, it did not fly there. So our best guess was firewood. The neighborhood where it was first introduced into Boulder, lots of rental properties, license plates from Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, all over the place. We have CU Boulder in Boulder, so a big student population. That's why insects moved very easily in firewood. That's why there are so many Don't Move Firewood campaigns across the country, across North America, Canada. Why is EAB so hard to detect? Well, the beetles attack, this is an infested ash tree here, one of our right-of-way trees in Boulder. They attack at the top of the canopy first. It takes years for the symptoms to really show up in trees. Let's see if I can get over here. As Deb had said, there's no available pheromone for the traps. In Colorado, as Ralph was saying, we have so many problems, weather-related problems with ash, the late spring freezes, the extreme temperature fluctuations. We see dieback in ash. We see ash bark beetle, heavy populations. This is actually, let's see, is there a laser pointer on this one? This is actually ash bark beetle, emergence from, we have a pedestrian mall in Boulder called Pearl Street Mall. 2 entire blocks were green ash. We had people come there and say, oh, you have emerald ash borer, before we ever detected emerald ash borer. But if you look, that's actually ash bark beetle emergence. Lots of ash bark beetle in those trees. Lots of lilac ash borer in those trees as well. So it makes detection even more difficult. We like to play a little game. Which of these trees has emerald ash borer? None of them, yes. Actually, none of those trees has emerald ash borer. That's everything from herbicide damage. This is actually a virus that we found in ash, just lilac ash borer, some random freeze damage, but actually none of those trees were infested with emerald ash borer. So EAB in Boulder. How did we actually detect it? Well, to say that we were looking for it is true, but there was some luck involved. In 2012, when it was detected in Kansas City, we figured, it's just one infested piece of firewood away from being in Colorado. So we changed our monitoring protocols, and we said any dead or dying ash trees, rather than just removing them, we were going to sample them prior to removal. And as luck, and I use that word loosely, would have it, we found it in the first tree that we sampled, the first dead ash tree. And that's actually it in the upper left corner there. But because of the great relationships that we had already with APHIS and the State Department of Ag, and we knew exactly who to call. They were a little bit surprised when we called, but we knew exactly who to call. We knew exactly what was going to happen, what process was going to be set in place when it was detected. So what does it look like in Boulder? Well, crown thinness. If you can stand underneath an ash tree and look up and see lots of daylight, probably an ash tree you want to take a closer look at. It doesn't necessarily mean it has emerald ash borer, but take a closer look at it. Crown thinness starting at the top of the tree, moving downward. We do often see early fall coloration up in the upper canopy. Not surprising, that's a sign of stress in trees. Progressing to what we affectionately call the ball of sprouts stage, which is kind of the tree's last-ditch effort to save itself before it actually dies. Progressing again to rows and rows of dead and dying ash trees. We do see the D-shaped exit holes, but by the time that we see them, at eye level, down on the bark, it's been in the tree for several years. The tree is already pretty much dead. We do see also the serpentine galleries under the bark, and we see the vertical bark splits quite often in the trees. And when you pop that bark back, you're going to see the little galleries underneath it. And sometimes in the early levels, the early stages of infestation, you'll actually see some woundwood development where the tree has been trying to wall it off. Whoop. Woodpeckering. As it was mentioned earlier, very diagnostic for emerald ash borer. The woodpeckers love going after the larvae. They pick all the bark off. So what you see is this blonding of the bark, which is very visible from a long distance away. Adults, you do see them up in the tree, but you don't see as many as I would have expected. Somehow when I first heard about emerald ash borer, I had this image of like clouds of emerald ash borer up in the canopies of trees. We don't see a whole lot of them when you get up in the trees, but they are there, obviously. But what is most diagnostic for us is the progression of symptoms. The symptoms progress fairly rapidly in the trees. This is a Google Street View of a row of ash trees from September 2014. This is the same row of trees in September 2016, and you can see the crown thinness is progressing there. That same row of trees just a year later. And then this is after the trees were removed the next month. So very quick progression of symptoms. So what do we do about it in Boulder? Someone had asked a question earlier about delimitation surveys in the Canadian Forest Service. We actually did a full delimitation survey in Boulder. APHIS, when we detected it, thought there could potentially maybe somehow be a way that we could eradicate it since it was so incredibly isolated. But we learned after doing the delimitation survey that was off the table. What we found out, we did work with the Canadian Forest Service on this using their branch sampling protocols. We split the city up into grids. We sampled 10 ash trees per grid where there were 10 ash trees. We only used public ash trees so that we didn't have to worry about notification. We pulled a whole lot of branches. I mean, a lot of branches. And we could never have done it without the collaborative effort of all of the different agencies involved. But what we found was these red grids is where it was detected. And in some cases, it was detected with just a single larva in one branch sample from one tree. But here's this swath right through the center of Boulder. So again, we knew that eradication was off the table. One of the first things we did was update our ash tree inventory. We could not afford at the time to do a full tree inventory update. We also didn't feel like we had the time to do that. So we went out and we quickly updated just the ash component to at least give us, we could at least then calculate the potential EAB costs and to help us identify what public ash trees would be worth treating long term. Also, the asset management component piece of an inventory software package, extremely, extremely helpful. It allows you to track not only the maintenance that's happening to each of those trees over time, but the costs associated with all of that maintenance over time. And then canopy assessments. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but again, very useful to set kind of the baseline. We were fortunate. Boulder did a canopy analysis in 2013, just prior to us finding emerald ash borer. Tree planting obviously has to be a component of any emerald ash borer program. You have to plant those replacement trees, or hopefully plant them in advance to compensate for the loss of the trees due to emerald ash borer. Diversity in tree species is key. I mean, one of the things we do, it really doesn't matter how many trees you're planting, but try and maximize the large maturing trees, the percent of large maturing. Our goal is 85% a year, and we try and plant, we average about 35 species a year. And don't forget private property. One of the important things that we figured out through our canopy analysis was that not only was the majority of our urban tree canopy on private property, but the most opportunity for tree planting was also on private property. Tree removals, unfortunately, has to be a component of any emerald ash borer program. Development review is something that we were very surprised about. Lots of ash on development review projects coming through. So suddenly you have to figure out, how am I going to handle this now with development review projects? Do we want to save these ash? Do we want to phase them out over time? Now, the risk component. John Ball with South Dakota State University has said his quote, turns ash into potato chips. And we have seen it. Now, ash, we already knew, was so incredibly susceptible to those snowstorms, the late spring, early fall snowstorms. Inevitably, it was the ash that got hit, even prior to emerald ash borer. But EAB does dry out the ash fairly quickly, so they can be more brittle. His guidelines are no climbing trees with greater than 20% canopy loss, no felling trees with greater than 40% canopy decline. And then he also noted that trees explode on impact so that the groundspeople have to be further away. Now, pesticide treatment. You know, as Deb had mentioned, very, very effective. I mean, we are successfully managing emerald ash borer in Boulder. And one of the biggest things that we're doing as a part of that are pesticide applications. They are, you know, clearly very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very effective. Our goal was to help not only preserve individual significant trees, but to help slow the progression down, not only within Boulder to prevent that mass die-off, but also slow that progression to other communities as well. We had a pretty strict criteria for what ash we would treat. We would only treat ash trees greater than 10 inches in diameter. They had to be in good condition, good location, not under power lines, all of that. We started out treating about 25% of our trees. Now, because some trees have had storm damage, they've been phased out through development, we're down to about 22%. Biocontrols, again, just an important part of an integrated pest management program. We did release biocontrols in conjunction with our State Department of Ag and APHIS. They were provided free to us. We kind of figured, why not? They are helping to reduce EAB populations. But again, they're not going to save individual ash trees, and they're not going to work on their own. Woodpeckers, yes, happy, happy woodpeckers. Very diagnostic, as I had mentioned before. In peeling studies, we have found up to 45% mortality of larvae because of woodpeckers. Dr. McCullough had said that's a very similar figure to the Midwest, what they were saying as well. Ensuring public safety, we do have a duty in many cities to enforce on private property owners who have dangerous trees that would affect public property. In Boulder, as you can see the numbers, we did see kind of a peak in 2017, 2018, but those figures are coming back down again. Those are all ash. We attribute that to the awareness and outreach campaigns that we had done. In Boulder, we kind of have a unique situation that we have 52% rental properties. So it is difficult to get in touch with some of these. Some of these are, the homeowners live in other states, that type of thing. So, but at least the compliance, we have seen really good compliance and the numbers are coming back down. Wood utilization, there's not a lot that I could say here. Unfortunately, we don't have the markets in Colorado for urban wood like there are in other parts of the country. We've tried pretty much everything, are trying everything, just to divert it from landfills. And we have successfully diverted everything from landfills, but it has been a struggle. Outreach, statewide trainings, this is really something that I think as an EAB response team, we are most proud of. We did multiple branch peeling, what we call dissection trainings, the first 3 winters after detection. Trained a whole bunch of industry personnel in what to look for, how to detect emerald ash borer, what the differences were between emerald ash borer and some of the other pests. We actually did EAB van tours, after the dissections. Those were very helpful, not necessarily for the foresters to see what the symptoms looked like in the field, but for the decision makers, because a lot of foresters brought their council members with them. They brought their financial experts with them. They brought, their directors with them so that they could actually see the impact to the community from the dead and dying ash trees. Now, the city of Boulder, Boulder County, we also did our own internal outreach. We did, needless to say, news releases, all of the normal types of things. One of the most popular was Boulder County actually did these little cardboard beer coasters and gave them out to all of the local brew pubs, had the website on the back, and they saw a huge uptick, needless to say, in their website traffic because of those. And then, we had, Kiss My Ash t-shirts, and I mean, the jokes are kind of endless when it comes to ash. But the outreach from Denver, they got additional funding, and they worked with a big PR firm to do the Be a Smart Ash campaign, which not only benefited the city of Denver, it benefited the entire region, because this was on 9 News, they did bus ads, they did, you name it. And they saw, I think they had 1.7 million followers on social media, like between 2014 and 2018 because of this. And they estimated that 2/3 of Denver proper residents were aware of the Be a Smart Ash campaign. Now, some of the lessons learned. We worked with Davie Resource Group and put together a story map, which is up on our website down here, which kind of summarizes a lot of what Ralph and I have been talking about this morning. So if you want more information, feel free to check out that story map. We were also, our EPIC work group was invited back in, I think it was 2018-19, to write an article for the Journal of International Forestry about the collaborative effort response that we had done for emerald ash borer. That's also up on that website, so feel free to check those out if you want more information. But the collaboration piece, and I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to speak really loudly for this, but clarifying agency roles, responsibilities, and limitations in advance of detection was super important. Again, we knew exactly who to call, we knew exactly what was going to happen, we knew exactly what agencies could do and could not do in the event of an EAB detection. Defining and implementing communication protocols in advance was also incredibly important. It's so important to have the same message going out statewide. You don't have one community saying one thing and another community saying another, and then the state saying something different, because the public is just going to get confused. Working together, we ensured consistent messaging, we developed shared outreach, website content, so it wasn't every city having to reinvent the wheel when it came to outreach. We created outreach as a group and then shared it statewide. We tracked the progression of EAB. It was on the state website, so everyone could see exactly where it was and it had not been detected yet. We split up the media requests. Within 2 months of our detection of emerald ash borer, we had over 75 media requests. Everyone from like NPR to Al Jazeera wanted to know how we felt about getting emerald ash borer in Colorado. There is no way that just as one little city group, we could have handled all of those media requests. So being able to spread that out among a group of agencies was so incredibly helpful. Some of the outcomes, helping communities manage EAB by reducing staff time. Again, hugely beneficial to us, not having to develop all that outreach, not having to do all those media requests. Shared communications, again, as part of that original ICS structure, they identified each agency had their communications people working together on the shared messaging. Other cities could piggyback off of the research, like this Denver Metro analysis, which helped us develop all of the numbers that Ralph showed you on that chart earlier, how many total ash in each of the communities. Denver paid for that, but all of us benefited from that. Also, the iTree eco analysis that Fort Collins had done, we were able then to say, okay, well, we started with 12% ash, so we're assuming that we have about 24% of ash in our urban tree canopy. Now, outreach. Extensive outreach and engagement has really been what helped garner support for our program in Boulder. When we first detected emerald ash borer, there was this giant pushback from what we later found out was kind of the vocal minority of let all the ash trees die. We don't want you to use pesticides for this. But we actually we did HOA meetings, we did open houses, we did surveys, and we actually figured out that the majority of people wanted us to preserve ash trees and wanted us to preserve the urban tree canopy in Boulder. It's also super important to provide information, up-to-date information on your website on what are the pesticide options for emerald ash borer, who are the licensed arborists in your community. Because things like that are only going to reduce the phone calls that you're going to get once you detect emerald ash borer. And then outreach efforts, as I mentioned with the Denver Be a Smart Ash campaign, outreach efforts from one group can benefit the whole. I mean, that Be a Smart Ash campaign benefited really the entire state of Colorado. Now, public awareness, our PR people keep reminding us of this, that public awareness does not always equate to action by the public, though. So, our team was very focused on, we don't want to tell people what to do because it's really kind of a personal decision. Do you want to use pesticides? Do you want to remove your tree? But you want to provide them with all of the information that they need to make that educated decision. But the point of a lot of the outreach in Colorado was to make a plan, to be informed and to make a plan. Just be aware of it and then know if you have an ash tree on your property, you have to act in some way. Now, detection. We talked a lot about detection earlier. Deb had talked about detection. The traps, we actually had them up. We have been working with APHIS for 5 years prior to our detection in Boulder, doing the traps in Boulder. We didn't catch a single beetle on those traps. They're unfortunately just not effective. Now, we did a lot of research after with the Canadian Forest Service and looking at different trap styles. And we did find out that if you hang different traps in a park with heavily infested trees, you do catch beetles. Here you can see these trees are very heavily infested. We did catch beetles on those traps. But for just as a detection tool, when you don't already have emerald ash borer and you're just trying to figure out if you do, probably not all that effective. Now, the delimitation survey. It was very effective in helping APHIS realize can't eradicate it. It's just off the table. It was very effective to help us understand as a city where it was within the city so that we could then focus our management efforts. Because the first year after detection, we started doing our pesticide applications with emamectin benzoate. And we just focused in on those red grids, where we knew it was in the highest populations was our assumption. And then each year out, we do a 3-year rotation. We just went out from there. Now, planning. We'd love to say EAB is an awful opportunity. It really is. I love this Lorax quote about it's not what it is, it's about what it can become. Because there's nothing that did more for urban and community forestry programs in Colorado than Dutch elm disease back in the 1980s. But you have to plan correctly. Planning can help you form partnerships in advance of finding emerald ash borer. It can, you get better tree diversity. Again, if you plan, stop planting ash. If Montana's still selling it, don't plant it. But take every opportunity that you can to promote urban forestry. You're going to have the opportunity to, in Colorado, we were able to speak to the state legislature, to the Metro Mayor's Caucus, to the Colorado Municipal League of like city managers, and take those opportunities not just to talk about emerald ash borer, but to promote urban forestry and the importance of the urban tree canopy and all of the services it provides, because that's only going to reap you more benefits in the future. And then the former Denver city forester liked to say that planning in advance will get you EAB, or at least enhanced arboricultural budgets, that a lot of cities, Boulder, Fort Collins, Denver, because we did plan, we have seen an increase in staffing and budget as a result of emerald ash borer. Now, management. You can see here I have listed the keys to maintain the tree canopy and public safety. These were kind of our tenets within our strategy. Trying to preserve significant ash trees with pesticides. We have been successful doing that. Planting more trees on both public and facilitating planting on private property. Prompt removal of untreated infested ash trees so that they don't pose a public safety risk. And then the long-term push to increase species diversity. And we actually started that prior to our EAB detection, but it is kind of a long-term shift. But what's cool is when you go back and look at your inventory figures from like 1997 to 2000 to 2010 to today, you can actually see the shift in, I suppose that I'm dating myself on how long I've been in Boulder, but you can actually see the shift in species diversity over time. And that's so awesome to see as a city forester. Pesticides, super effective at preserving ash trees and slowing the progression of EAB and allowing for proactive rather than reactive management. The 3-year rotation of emamectin benzoate has been very effective for us. Some cities and groups within Colorado are contemplating moving to a 4-year rotation because they're just not seeing the pressure from emerald ash borer. And then biocontrols are effective at lowering EAB populations, and the woodpeckers are quite happy. So now management. I'm not going to go into details about pesticides, but all I want to say is pesticides, when it comes to EAB, very, very, very confusing and complicated. And every phone call that we had initially with a resident was like 20 minutes long, because they wanted to know, well, what should I use for emerald ash borer? Talk me through all the options. And when you look at all of these different, different pesticide options, different efficacies, different formulations, application techniques, timing, et cetera, and so forth, very complicated. It is very, very important to be educated on the pesticides so that you are able to help your clients, help your community understand their options so that you're basically helping them to choose what they should be doing. But keep in mind, you have to stay up, because once we kind of got all this down and understood it, then they changed all the formulations on us. So it's important to attend those webinars, stay up to date. Now, management, the scale of everything you do changes. You're planting more trees, you're removing more trees. You're suddenly applying pesticides to 500 trees a year when previously you were only applying pesticides to 30 trees a year. So, as a forester, as a city, or even as a private, tree care company, the scale changes. And so that's something that you have to plan for. Your purchasing requirements may then change. And then you need to look at everything through what I call EAB glasses. Your contract specifications. When we first detected it, we were still under quarantine restrictions, so we had to change all of our contractor specs. How do you appraise the value of an ash now? Does it differ if it's treated versus untreated? What do you do with ash in a development review process? Do you want to preserve them? Do you want to phase them out? What's the right answer there? And there is no one correct answer across the board. Depends on community values and what's the condition of the individual trees. But it's something to think about in advance. Do your city codes need to be updated? If so, typically that's a very long process. You might want to start that in advance. And then risk assessments. Again, now you're doing risk assessments for ash trees that have emerald ash borer or may have emerald ash borer. And then rotational pruning. This was another one. We had, inevitably you get to that question of, okay, we have a rotational prune contract in progress. Are we going to prune the ash trees that we're not treating? And that's just something to think about long term. That was something that we had to deal with kind of up front. We decided, yes, we were going to do that because we didn't know how long those trees would be there. And in hindsight, it actually turned out to be a pretty good decision just because we have been able to slow the progression of EAB down. We still have many, many ash in Boulder that are untreated and look perfectly fine. Now, the number of service requests. If you notice this, like from 2013 to 2014, the numbers doubled from one year to the next. Initially, a lot of these were emerald ash borer calls. What do I do about emerald ash borer? How do I treat for it? Who do I call to remove my tree? But as time went on, the number of requests stayed up. And a lot of that, those last year, we might have had 10 calls about emerald ash borer, directly about emerald ash borer. But a lot of this is deferred maintenance because you're not spending the time doing all of the rotational pruning that you had once done. Suddenly now, all of your pruning requests are going up from the public. That's just one example. But yes, so indirect, probably yes, related back to emerald ash borer. Just kind of a snapshot of our tree planting numbers over time on the top and our tree removal numbers on the bottom. And this is all species, not just ash. And my point here is even though we increase the number of trees we were planting every year, the number of removals is still exceeding those number of trees that are planted. So yes, we are still losing tree canopy because of emerald ash borer. But the other thing to make note of here is unfortunately as foresters, emerald ash borer is not the only thing that you deal with when you have it. During this time in 2014, in 2013 we found emerald ash borer. 2014, in November, we had that severe temperature fluctuation, and we actually had about 500 large Siberian elms die because of that we had to remove. So a lot of these numbers are also Siberian elms that we were dealing with too. We had 2 spring snowstorms that we had to deal with in 2016. We had a big September snowstorm in 2020. So again, it kind of compounds, as time goes on. Now, management. When you look at doing the urban tree canopy assessments, one thing I want to mention, well, a couple things I want to mention here. First, if you look closely, and again, we'll give you this PowerPoint, whatever, the red here is the canopy loss that we have seen in certain parts of Boulder. Now, this neighborhood is one of the original neighborhoods where we think EAB was first introduced. Over 75% rental properties in there. A lot of absentee landlords, a lot of ash trees on private property in there, a lot of Siberian elms in there as well that we lost in that deep freeze. The other thing I want to point out, if you look at, you can't expect to remove trees this size and plant back with little 2-inch caliper trees and not lose canopy. It's not going to happen. Canopy loss is inevitable unless you plant more trees and potentially preserve more trees. I mean, if I look back in hindsight on our strategy, I think one of the biggest regrets that I have is not treating more trees than we did. We were extremely conservative. I mean, we talked to a lot of cities across the Midwest that said, we're treating around, 25%, 30%, 35%. We said, okay, we'll kind of stick in there. We chose 25%. But looking back in hindsight, I think we should have tried to preserve more long-term and preserve that canopy because it does take so long for these little trees to get back up to this size. Now, EAB biology in Colorado, this is a tough one. First of all, the degree day models, completely accurate, work perfectly fine in Colorado. EAB emerges when black locusts are blooming. If you drive around and you're seeing black locust in bloom, that's when the EAB are starting to fly. But it does appear that EAB is moving more slowly in Colorado. Why is that? I mean, we could just say, well, we're managing it. We're using pesticides. We're using biocontrols. We're using an integrated approach. We are reducing those EAB populations. But there could also be some weather or climate issue that's in there as well that's kind of helping us. We don't have a lot of native ash in Colorado, very little. Very little naturalized ash. I mean, we have some, but it's only along like the creeks and drainages. So EAB has to travel further. That's not the contiguous ash forests that you see in the Midwest. We get a lot of those late spring freezes. And two pieces here. Could the beetles, which Deb's counterpart in Colorado has told us that the adults are likely the most vulnerable to cold temperatures. So if they're emerging, might they get zapped by some of these late spring freezes? I don't know, could be a stretch, but something to consider. But another thing with the late spring freezes, I mean, we've seen some of these freezes in May. So the ash trees have already started to leaf out. And then emerald ash borer is already starting to emerge. And so when all of those ash then freeze, what happens to those EAB adults? They have to feed on the leaves. So do they just hunker down and wait? Do they fly further? Do they then go to maybe white ash, didn't freeze the same way green ash did? I don't know. I mean, but we don't have all the answers, but those are just, we kind of have more questions than answers there. But it's something to consider that in the West, EAB might act differently. But one of the biggest factors is how dry it is. When we were talking to Deb the other night, she said, of all of these factors, the dry is what she would really think could be hindering or helping to slow the EAB progression because of that extreme low humidity, the extreme dry that we have in Colorado. There is a map up on the State Forest Service website here, just tracking the progression of EAB in Colorado. You can see, a lot of the northern Denver metro area spread to Fort Collins, inevitably Firewood. It's down here in Littleton. It was actually detected last year way over here in Carbondale by Aspen. But the Denver metro proper hasn't detected it yet. Do they have it? Inevitably, of course they do. But it's so hard to detect, they haven't officially detected it yet. Economics and partnerships. EAB is expensive. I mean, everything about it is expensive. The tree inventory, the removals, the planting, I mean, you name it. I mean, these are just some of our costs from Boulder. I won't go through them, but again, you'll have this information. Something else to keep in mind, though, is the private component. That, it's not just cities that see the impact. It's also the private property owners. And unfortunately, the disproportionately impacted populations, when you look at the wealth inequities, and often those folks are those who are impacted the most. In the city of Denver, what Ralph was showing you earlier, that comparison, what they found in Denver was that in the wealthy neighborhoods, most of the ash were street trees in the public right-of-way, whereas in the poorer neighborhoods, most of the ash were on private property, and therefore all of those expenses fell to those property owners. So that's something to consider when you're developing your plan is, where are your ash trees? And watch your messaging because, private property owners, if they let ash trees die in their backyard, these big dead ash trees, you're not supposed to send arborists up into those trees to climb. You can't access it with a bucket truck. So these suddenly become crane removals. Very expensive. The price goes up astronomically. The tree care companies. We've actually talked to a lot of the tree care companies in Boulder. We've had such difficulties, at least initially, after the detection, finding tree care companies to work for us because they had all the work that they needed elsewhere. But EAB does drive the costs up. One advantage that the arborists saw was if they use this as an opportunity, again, EAB can be an awful opportunity, it helped increase their client lists, because rather than just knocking on a door and saying, hey, can I treat your ash tree? It was more of a knocking on the door saying, hey, can I take care of all of the trees on your property? And by the way, you have an ash tree, do you want me to talk to you about your ash tree? But why are the prices increasing? We heard everything: increased demand for services, labor shortages, the local cost of living. Boulder County, extremely, extremely expensive to live there. Quarantine restrictions. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about those anymore. Increased risk to arborists, and then the dead ash dulls their chainsaws and chipper knives. So there's more maintenance associated with it. Now, deferred maintenance, I had mentioned this earlier. There is so much staff time directed towards EAB. So even if your direct costs are not going to EAB, you no longer have the staff time to manage those rotational prune contracts, for example. Our street rotation increased from 10 to 14 years because of emerald ash borer. Our parks rotation increased from 8 to 10 years. Now those figures are starting to come back down again, because after like the first 4 years, we just basically said, EAB is now part of our general operations. We're not doing separate ash removal contracts. We're not, everything is just going to be integrated into our total program. And that helped quite a bit. But we still saw huge cost increases between 2014 and 2018. Tree removals for ash trees less than 15 inches in diameter, there was a 75% increase in costs. And tree removals for ash trees greater than 16 inches, there was a 38% increase in those costs. Now again, those costs, they're starting to come back down again, but that is significant. When you're talking about a city with 100,000 people, trying to maintain our 50,000 trees. Economics and partnerships, grants, partnerships, super, super important. Hopefully you have the idea now that collaboration and partnerships and working with other agencies will help you tremendously. Even as a private tree care company, it helps tremendously. And I just want to end it with, it is so important to try and maintain a sense of humor with this. EAB, it's overwhelming. It can be dark, it can be depressing, but our EAB response team was wonderful in trying to keep morale up within our group. They did an ode to branch peeling and changed all the words to "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." These are just a couple of the better stanzas in there. They did Yule ash trees, we did little dioramas, with Legos and a la Game of Thrones and adult beetles and just anything to have fun and try and keep morale up. Because, the takeaway message here is, yes, it can be overwhelming. It will be overwhelming when you first detect it, but it is manageable. And if you form your team and you work together and you plan in advance, I think you got this.